This is Chapter 11, Part A on the nervous system and nervous tissue. So the nervous system is our master controlling and communicating system of the body. So the cells of the nervous system are going to communicate via both electrical and chemical signals. So this means their communication is very rapid and specific, and usually is going to have almost an immediate response. The nervous system has three overlapping functions. So the first function is our sensory input. So information about the internal and external environment of the body will be gathered by our sensory receptors. So things like our eyes, our touch receptors, our sense of smell, hearing. So this sensory input will travel to the central nervous system via these sensory input pathways. Step 2 is integration. So now the central nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord has to process and interpret this incoming sensory information and decide how we want to respond. So then our third function is motor output. So this is where the central nervous system will send a signal to an effector organ. So effector organs are what have an effect, right? So this is going to be our response to the sensory input. So effector organs include muscles and glands, right? So this example, we have our sensory input, our eyes looking at the glass of water, right, sending that information to the brain, and then the central nervous system will send a signal telling the muscles in the arm to contract to lift the glass of water. So another common example of this pathway, so when you're driving, right, so you see a red light. So our sensory receptors in the eye see the red traffic light, right? That sensory input goes to the central nervous system where it would then be integrated. So it'll be processed and interpreted, right? So the brain will interpret that red means stop. So then we'll send our motor output to the skeletal muscles of the leg that you would then go to tap the brake in the car. So the nervous system is divided into two main branches. So we have our central nervous system that consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So it's kind of just centralized in the body. So this is going to include our integration and control centers. So this is where we're going to interpret that incoming sensory information and then dictate that outgoing motor output signal. The peripheral nervous system is everything that's outside of the central nervous system. So mainly your nerves that are going to extend from both the brain and the spinal cord. So we'll look at the different types of nerves later on, but the two main types are spinal nerves that come to and from the spinal cord, and then we have cranial nerves that come to and from the brain itself. So looking at the peripheral nervous system, we can then divide it further into two subdivisions. So we have our sensory or our afferent division. So this would be your incoming sensory impulses from the skin, the skeletal muscles, joints, as well as visceral sensory fibers. So we also have sensory neurons for our visceral organs, or things like your digestive organs. So afferent means it's the incoming or the arriving information. So this is shown with the blue arrows going toward the central nervous system. So the second subdivision is the motor or efferent, right? So efferent for the exiting division. So this is going to send impulses from the central nervous system to those effector organs. And again, your effector organs are whatever is going to have an effect. So includes your muscles, skeletal muscles, and the glands. Right? So this is shown with the red arrows, meaning that it's outgoing information. So later on, we'll look at the further subdivisions of this motor or efferent division that we can separate into either somatic or autonomic. So again, somatic is just your voluntary motor function. So things like your skeletal muscles, things that we have conscious control over. The autonomic nervous system is your involuntary or your automatic nervous system. So this would be things like impulses to heart muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle like in the digestive tract, and some of your glands. Right, so again, the somatic nervous system are just your motor nerve fibers. So it's sending impulses from the central nervous system to that skeletal muscle to trigger a muscle contraction. So again, this is part of the voluntary nervous system. So whenever you see somatic, it's talking about conscious control, voluntary control of those skeletal muscles. So the autonomic nervous system, we said, was for your automatic functions. So this is primarily your visceral motor nerve fibers. So visceral just means like organs or gut, so things like your digestive tract. Also helps to regulate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So again, this is involuntary. We don't have any real conscious control over these structures. So then we can divide the autonomic system even further into the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions that we'll talk about in chapter 14. So the sympathetic division essentially is your fight or flight. So it's going to mobilize your body systems during emergency situations. So it can speed up your heart rate, deliver more blood and nutrients and oxygen to your muscles, so that way you can fight off an attacker or run away from a dangerous situation. The parasympathetic is sometimes referred to as the rest and digest system. So again, working in opposition. So it's going to be the opposite of your fight or flight. So if you're not running for your life or fighting off an attacker, you'll be at rest, you'll be calm, and maybe digesting. So this is going to help conserve your energy and promote those non-emergency functions like digestion and urination. So looking at some nervous tissue histology, so we talked about before in the tissues chapter that nervous tissue is composed of two different types of cells. So neuroglia, sometimes referred to as glial cells, are basically your supporting cells. The neurons are the active nerve cells that are going to transmit those electrical signals and those impulses. So this figure is just showing how we have our primary neuron or nerve cell, and then the neuroglial cells. We have a few different types that we'll look at, are either going to attach or be around the neurons just to help support them in their impulse function. So in the central nervous system, there are four main types of neuroglial cells that we'll look at. So astrocytes, microglial cells, ependymal cells, and oligodendrocytes. Right? So these are your four for the central nervous system. So these are found only in the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system, neuroglial cells we'll look at later. There are only two, so satellite cells and Schwann cells. So astrocytes are the most abundant and versatile of the neuroglial cells in the central nervous system. So they're called astro. Astro means star because they have this highly branched or star-shaped appearance. So they're essentially going to be found clinging to the neurons close to those synaptic endings. So synaptic endings are just where different neurons are going to meet and information transfer sites, as well as the capillaries. You can see they're attached to both the neuron and the surrounding capillaries. So some of their functions include just to help support and brace the neurons, kind of form that network of the neurons, as well as being kind of that bridge between the capillaries and the neurons. So they help play a role in nutrient and gas exchange there. They can also help guide the migration of young neurons. So they help these young neurons kind of get to where they need to go for their final resting place. Help control chemical environment around the neurons. So some metabolic waste that may be given off from these cells that we don't want to accumulate. The astrocytes just help kind of keep the immediate area clean and tidy. They help to respond to nerve impulses and neurotransmitters, influence overall neural function, and participate in some of that information processing or that integration in the brain. Microglial cells are smaller, kind of oval-shaped cells with these highly branched, thorny-looking processes. So they kind of branch out in all directions and make contact with different neurons just to kind of monitor the health of those neurons. So if they detect any neurons have been injured or damaged, they will migrate toward those areas. And if needed, they can transform into phagocytes or eating cells to remove any microbes or neuronal debris. So this is essentially like the immune system cells of the central nervous system. Ependymal cells are typically ciliated, so they're going to line the cavities of the brain and the spinal column. So the ventricles or the open areas, open cavities in the central nervous system would be lined by these ependymal cells that have cilia. So those cavities in the brain and the spinal cord are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So these ependymal cells are just going to help form a barrier between that fluid and the tissue around the cells. And also the cilia are going to help to keep that fluid circulating. So it's not sitting just stagnant in the central nervous system. It's constantly flowing and circulating all throughout. Oligodendrocytes are branched cells that are going to wrap around the nerve fibers and form what's called the myelin sheath. So the myelin sheath is just going to help insulate the electrical charges that's being transmitted down these neurons. So in the peripheral nervous system, we only have two major neuroglial cells. So the first ones are satellite cells. So these are going to surround the actual neuron cell body. So the cell body we'll look at, it's just the part of the neuron that has the nucleus and all of the cell parts and organelles. So they're going to function similar to the astrocytes in the central nervous system, in that they're just going to help support and protect the overall neuron health. The Schwann cells, sometimes referred to as a neurolimocyte, so these are going to surround the peripheral nerve fibers, or the actual nerves, and form the myelin sheath. So again, it's similar function as those oligodendrocytes in that it's going to form the myelin sheath, and the myelin sheath, again, is just to help insulate and conserve that electrical impulse as it travels down the axon. So without the myelin sheath, some of that electricity, some of that energy would kind of dissipate away, and the impulse, the message might not make it all the way to the end of the nerve fiber. So neurons themselves are sometimes referred to as nerve cells. So these are the structural units of our nervous system. So they're highly specialized to conduct these electrical impulses. So some special characteristics of neurons include extreme longevity. So some neurons can last your entire lifetime. So think of some of your earliest childhood memories. So those neurons that were formed when you made those memories are still intact, or still there today. Generally, neurons are amitotic, meaning that they do not divide or clone themselves. They don't undergo normal cell division. They also have very high metabolic rates, so they require a constant supply of oxygen and glucose for energy production. So all neurons have a cell body and one or more processes. So again, the cell body is kind of the main hub of the neuron where all of the cell parts are found. So we have the nucleus, right? We have our endoplasmic reticulum, we have some mitochondria, some ribosomes. The processes would be what's coming off of that cell body. So like the axon, this long process coming off, and the dendrites are these shorter processes that are branching from that cell body. So the neuron cell body is sometimes called the perikaryon or the soma, though these terms are sometimes used interchangeably. But again, it's just the biosynthetic center of the neuron. So meaning this is where the nucleus is found, this is where the DNA, all of the organelles are found, all of the proteins are going to be synthesized in this cell body. So most neuron cell bodies are located in the central nervous system. So when we refer to clusters of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system, they're referred to as nuclei. So sometimes we'll talk about the specific nuclei in the brain. So nuclei refer to number of cell bodies in the central nervous system, so within the brain and the spinal cord. So they're going to be found in more the gray matter of the brain. So later on we'll talk about the difference between the gray matter and the white matter, but the nuclei are going to be found typically in this gray matter. Whereas ganglia we refer to as clusters of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So anything outside of the brain or the spinal cord we'll refer to as ganglia. So these are going to form what are called the nerve plexuses. So we'll look at those later on. So you have a brachial plexus, so the arms or the nerves that serve the upper arm, or you have the sacral plexus, it's just the group of nerves and cell bodies that form the lower body. So nuclei versus ganglia. So we talked about neuron processes. So these are anything that are going to extend off of that main cell body. So in the central nervous system will contain both the cell body and the processes. So everything is kind of self-contained in that central location, whereas the peripheral nervous system contains mostly the neuron processes. So things like the axons or the nerves. So when we refer to bundles of neuron processes in the central nervous system, they're referred to as a tract. When we look at these bundles of processes in the peripheral nervous system, then they're referred to as nerves. Right? So this figure is showing some tracts or some bundles of processes in the spinal cord. Right? So they're referred to as tracts, whereas the nerves, everything coming off of the spinal cord, these long fibrous structures, are bundles of axons and neuron processes in that peripheral nervous system. So showing, again, your basic neuron with two types of processes. So the dendrites are the shorter processes that are going to be primarily your receptive region. So the dendrites are going to receive the messages, right, deliver those to the cell body. The axons are going to be your outgoing process. So the impulses will be sent down the axon to communicate with another neuron or with that effector organ. Right. So again, dendrites in a motor neuron can contain hundreds of these short branching processes. Again, they are the input or the receptive region of the neuron. So they're the receiving end of a neuron. They're going to receive these signals and messages from other neurons. So these incoming messages down the dendrites are going to be conveyed using a graded potential. So graded potential is similar to an action potential in that it is an electrical impulse. So it's sending a signal via electrical impulse, but it is a short distance signal. So really it's only going from the tip of the dendrite just right here to the cell body. So they're not as strong as an action potential because they don't have to travel the same length that an action potential would. So again, your action potentials then would be your long distance signals. Right? So it's going to go from the very beginning of that axon all the way to the very end. So each neuron has one axon that's going to begin at this little cone-shaped area called the axon hillock. So some neurons have shorter axons, some have very long axons. Right? So some axons can be over 1 meter long. So these would be maybe the nerve that goes all the way down to your toes, right, and then back up. So these very long axons we refer to as nerve fibers. So the axons, once they get to the end of the axon, they start to branch profusely, right, at the terminal region. So one axon can have as many as 10,000 terminal branches. So these distal or these far off endings are called axon terminals. So we said the axon was the conducting region of the neuron. So it's going to generate those impulses and then transmit them along the membrane or the axolemma. So remember when we talked about muscle cells, they have sometimes their own special names for the cell parts. So in the muscle cell, it was the sarcolemma. Well, in a axon or a neuron cell, it is called the axolemma. So it's just the cell membrane. Right? So it's going to generate and transmit those impulses all the way down the cell membrane until it reaches the axon terminals. So the axon terminals will then release neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are just kind of the chemical messengers of the nervous system. So depending on the type of neurotransmitter, it could have an excitatory response, so it could stimulate a cell to do something, or it could inhibit or prevent a cell from doing something. So we already talked about this kind of with muscle contraction, right? So you send the signal to the motor neuron, right, and it releases acetylcholine, right, at that neuromuscular junction, which would then excite the muscle cell to contract. So these axons, these neurons, are capable of carrying on multiple conversations with different neurons at the same time. So you can think about more than one thing, right? You can walk and chew gum at the same time because our axons, our neurons, are able to carry on kind of these multiple conversations. So the axons are going to rely on those cell bodies to renew proteins and membranes. Remember, the nucleus, all of the organelles are way back in that cell body. So anything that needs to be replaced or touched up would be generated at that cell body location. So because the axons themselves are amitotic, they don't have the ribosomes to make proteins or DNA in them. Everything is back home at home base with the cell body. So these axons can quickly decay if they're cut or damaged. So the myelin sheath, as we said, was important for insulating that electrical impulse. So the myelin sheath is composed of myelin, which is just kind of a fatty protein substance. But again, it's going to work to electrically insulate the axon and protect it, as well as increasing our speed of impulse transmission. Right, so think of the myelin sheath kind of like the rubber coating on an electrical wire, right? So it keeps that electricity contained and insulated in the wire, right? So we don't have any shorts, right, or any issues with the electricity. So your myelinated fibers have this segmented myelin sheath that's going to surround most of the length of the axon. So again, the impulse conduction for myelinated fibers would be much faster than the speed of conduction on your non-myelinated fibers. So again, the myelin is helping to insulate and preserve that impulse. So without the myelin sheath, a lot of that electrical energy will just kind of dissipate away. And by the time we get to the axon terminal, it may not be a strong enough signal to elicit the response that we need. So looking at myelination in the peripheral nervous system. So we said this was formed by the Schwann cells, right, one of those glial cells. So it's going to wrap around the axon, kind of like a jelly roll. So one Schwann cell will just form one segment of that myelin sheath. So this is showing the Schwann cells going to kind of envelop or wrap around the axon and then kind of rotate and twist on itself to make multiple layers. So still looking at myelination in the peripheral nervous system with the myelin sheath gap. So we said that one Schwann cell just forms one segment of that myelin sheath, but we still have these little gaps in between the cells. So these gaps are sometimes called nodes of Ranvier or just a myelin sheath gap. So sometimes you can have an axon collateral emerge from these gaps. An axon collateral is just where we would have another axon branch off somewhere along the length of our first axon. But these gaps are important when we look at impulse conduction. So myelin sheaths in the central nervous system, we said, was formed by the oligodendrocytes. So they're a bit different from the Schwann cells in that one oligodendrocyte can wrap around up to 60 axons at once. So instead of being these little individual segments, we have this branching arrangement where it can reach out and actually wrap around multiple axons with one cell. So again, looking at myelination in the central nervous system. So we said myelin was kind of a fatty protein substance. So this is going to be shown when we look at gray matter versus white matter in the brain and the central nervous system. So your white matter are regions of the brain and spinal cord that have this myelin sheath in their cells. So they have a dense collection of myelinated fibers. Usually these are going to be your tracts. The gray matter then would be mostly neuron cell bodies that are non-myelinated fibers. So again, because the myelin is a fatty substance, you can think of it kind of like the marbling on a steak. So the white marbling on a steak would be the fat in it. So basically the white matter, the white marbling in the brain is covered with that fatty myelin protein. So neurons can be classified based on their structure or their function, so just like pretty much everything else in anatomy and physiology. So there's 3 types of structural classification we can look at with these neurons. So they're classified based on how many processes do they have coming off of that cell body. So a multipolar neuron has 3 or more processes. So this is the most common kind of stereotypical type of neuron here. So multipolar means that we have multiple processes coming off with the dendrites, and we have the axon coming off as well. A bipolar neuron only has 2 processes, so 1 axon and 1 dendrite, so bi meaning 2. So these are more rare. They're typically only found in the sensory neurons, so things like the retina, the eye, the olfactory mucosa in the nose. So these sensory neurons really don't need multiple processes because they have kind of a one-way street of transmission. So it's going to go straight from the sensory receptors in your nose or your eye straight to the brain. So there's no sidetracks, no detours with these neurons. Unipolar have one true process, but it's more like a T-like process. So it has 2 axons. So it has one process coming off the cell body itself, but then from there it can fork or divide off into the peripheral process or the distal process. So this would be associated with the sensory receptor. So our incoming information is going to come on the peripheral side, and the central process or the proximal process is what's going to actually enter into the central nervous system. So again, these are also more rare and found in places like the sensory receptors. So by and large, multipolar is going to be the most common type of neuron that we'll deal with. So again, this is just showing some examples of these different structural classes. So your multipolar would be like a standard motor neuron. Right? So we have that motor neuron leaving the central nervous system and entering the muscle, right, where then it would branch and divide to make contact with individual muscle fibers. Your bipolar would be like in the retina of the eye. So again, dealing with sensory information, we don't really need any other detours or routes. We have just kind of a point A to point B. So from the retina straight to the brain. Unipolar, similar concept with some sensory receptors in the skin. So it's just going to connect to some of these sensory receptors or glands in the skin and send those impulses back to the central nervous system. So functionally, we can classify neurons into 3 groups. So depending on the direction that their impulse is traveling. So either it's traveling toward the central nervous system or it's traveling away. So your sensory neurons are going to transmit impulses toward that central nervous system. So again, almost all of these would be unipolar or bipolar. And then the cell bodies would be located in the ganglia of the peripheral nervous system. So example, you step on a nail, right? You have a pinprick on your skin. So we have touch receptors, pain receptors that are going to send that information, that sensory information from your skin to the central nervous system. So motor neurons would be the opposite. So they're going to carry impulses away from the central nervous system toward those effector organs. So again, things like skeletal muscles, glands, anything that has an effect. So most of these will be multipolar, right, because they'll need to make contact with multiple neurons and multiple cells. So most of the cell bodies for these are located in the central nervous system. So the third type are interneurons. So these are the neurons that are almost entirely within the central nervous system, sometimes referred to as association neurons. So these are kind of the integration center neurons. So the incoming sensory information travels to the spinal cord, is then going to be processed and handled and interpreted by this interneuron, and then our outgoing message will be sent to that motor neuron.